Welcome to the Seatrade Maritime Podcast. This is Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News. Today is our latest episode of our series Chat about Geopolitics and Trade, or Chat GPT, with guest presenter Punit Ozza, founder of Maritime NXT. Punit is going to be talking to Captain Subhangshu Dutt, director of OM Maritime. You will hear from Captain Dutt about his first experience of geopolitics impacting shipping some 50 years ago. And then, can you guess which third country, thousands of miles away, shipments from India to Pakistan were moved from to avoid trade embargoes? And you'll also hear about modern-day examples of shipping and trade patterns shifting due to geopolitical events. Now with that, I'd like to hand over to Punit.
Thank you so much, Marcus, and welcome to another episode on Chat about Geopolitics and Trade, as I call it, my Chat GPT. It's a pleasure to have Captain Subhangshu Dutt as our guest today. Captain Subhangshu Dutt is someone I have known since the last 15 to 16 years, since I've been here in Singapore. And today he's the executive director of OM Maritime, owning company, and obviously he has been involved in the shipping for decades. It's a pleasure to speak to you, Captain Dutt. You've been involved earlier with Krishnapatnam Port, with Pacific Shipping Trust, with even being a past board member of Singapore Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, SICI. And it's a great pleasure to always talk to you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Punit, and thanks, Marcus. Indeed, yes, I'm really happy to be here and share with you the string of work experiences that I've been through. Yes, so I hope we come up with some really relevant stuff at the end of the interview. Mhm.
Thank you so much. And for the listeners who don't know, Captain Dutt is also on the current EXCO of the Institute of Chartered Shipbrokers Singapore branch. He has been the past chairman. I am the vice chairman of the current branch. So obviously it's a long relationship that we've had. But interestingly, he has also been teaching for many years at the Singapore Management University, the students on the maritime and shipping business space. So again, this is something that is a special podcast, which we also want to reach out to the students. So Captain, the first question that I wanted to ask you was about geopolitics in general. How do you see from your own vast experience geopolitics pervading every single shipping and trade aspect? And what kind of examples can you piece together from your amazing career in terms of how geopolitics has actually affected decision making and even trade and shipping in general? That would be really nice to have your fascinating insight on this.
My so-called long career in the industry, I can go back to some global events, which if we look back in retrospect, yes, had a tremendous impact on shipping. So about the time I started sailing, which is about 50 years odd now, 50 plus years, there was this Arab-Israeli war. Okay, call it the 7-Day War, whatever. Post that war, the Suez Canal got closed, 1973, and it was closed for almost 3 years, if I recollect. For those 3 years, you can imagine what happened to shipping. Mm. Every service. I mean, we used to work for SCI, an Indian company. So all the services went round the Cape to Europe, to the US. I don't think we had the tools then to sort of simulate the effect, but those were the good years when every sector of shipping went berserk, went through the roof, primarily because of demand. Yes, so that was my first experience of geopolitics. I didn't really understand very much then, except that the number of days we will not get letters from home will be much longer. But that was it, yeah. And then we moved on. I became an officer, and then worked with what was Singapore's national line, sailed with them, which of course no longer exists. But then we also saw very visible examples of geopolitics. Country, rather South Africa itself, used to back then have the policy of apartheid. Okay, obviously the Western nations and the United States banned all trade with South Africa because of the apartheid policy. But I don't think South Africa would be deprived of its um, oil and whatever. So happily, a lot of shipping companies were doing it under the veil of secrecy. Thank God we didn't have social media then, so things were things could be kept reasonably confidential. So that was my second um, um, experience with geopolitics. Again, uh, we didn't really describe it as geopolitics, but one realized that trade goes on, regardless of all the restrictions being put in place.
Well, this is interesting, Captain. Before you go further, trade doesn't exist in a vacuum is something that one of our guests, Khalid Hashim, mentioned that somehow trade finds a way. Did you actually see that the kind of trade flows into South Africa, the countries which were trading with South Africa, were either crisscrossing through other friendly countries? New trade flows were opening up because of the fact that people had to circumvent certain spaces to get to South Africa. Is that something that you can actually see, bringing you to the present day? That you can see that in Iranian example today or other places as well, where you actually see that the countries are still trading with those so-called sanctioned countries or countries which are under sanctions, but they obviously are circumventing or moving it through a new route. Is that something which you have always seen happen? And would South Africa be in a similar bracket as Iran today, for example?
Okay, that's a very loaded question. Uh, but back then, being the master of the ship, one couldn't really have access to what else is happening. This is a tanker. I again breaching confidentiality after 50, 40 years. I guess doesn't matter anymore. But this was crude
Time
oil.
bars.
The emphasis on petroleum was much more. I guess you're right that the container trade or the general cargo trade moved in through adjacent countries like Mozambique, etc., and they were not sensitive commodities. So oil was definitely so. They obviously made a lot of effort in disguising the documents, etc. Moving on, yes, more and more countries have these sanctions, either bilateral sanctions or otherwise. What I really witnessed was of course we India and Pakistan, the two neighbors, and then we were with PIL that time, so we were serving both countries. But what was happening was no trade was not permitted between India and Pakistan. No point.
Direct trade was
Which
not
which
permitted.
is
Yeah.
which is ridiculous because each of the countries has so much to offer to the other. You just cross the road and you're there in the next country, but it was prohibited. So we had cases where an Indian export to Pakistan, 4 or 5 containers, we used to load them, bring it to Singapore, switch documents, and ship it back to Pakistan, which could have gone across in 2 hours across the border.
This is so fascinating, Captain. That one of the topics that I discuss is there is actually a report. I don't know whether I can send it to you separately, but it's actually an interesting report which says that good neighbors and good neighborly relations are actually very bad for trade. So, so this is a classic example that India and Pakistan basically working through Singapore. It's fascinating. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, great example. Great example.
Yeah, so you're right. If countries, and not only countries, the people within the countries or the companies want to trade with each other, because trader is very sharp, a businessman. He knows the right commodity at the right price is available at this country, but the government regulations don't permit it. So India and China is another example. When the trade opened up, it really accelerated to such volume that at one point, within 3 or 4 years, China had become India's biggest trading partner.
Correct.
So,
You're
but
right.
but relationships are not all that rosy still. But I think some governments see some sensibility that look, if trade is permitted, the whole population benefits because they get their commodities and goods at the right price, and they are able to some extent avoid inflation or rising prices. So yeah, I agree with you that even if relationships aren't that good, some extent trade should be permitted. Of course then the security people come in, that what do we know what's coming in, etc. So that is the visible examples I've seen of geopolitics and trade affecting geopolitics.
Very interesting, Captain Dutt. And one follow up question from this is, one of the things that I have noticed and which I am trying to imbibe through the course as well as through these podcasts is to try and bring geopolitics front and center when it comes to trade and shipping. Why do you think, and do you actually feel yourself that the mainstream media, be it the financial newspapers and other publications, don't really highlight a lot of the trade aspects when they talk about geopolitics? When you have news headlines in Financial Times, they mostly deal with economic news, they deal a lot with the political news, sometimes they deal with personalities as well, but they don't really talk about how trade gets impacted. The impact of China on the African countries, or even the BRICS expansion or the BRICS plus now. There's not a lot of discussion about trade. Why is it that that doesn't really come on the forefront? As a decision maker today, having your own ships, being a part of a pool, do you actually see that discussion being front and center on geopolitics when it comes to decision making in shipping? And how do you see that going forward? Because that will be very interesting for us to focus on as well, which is what our podcast is trying to look at. So, if your views on this can be very interesting for us.
Okay, thank. Okay, first I'll try and reply you in the very broad context globally. The media, yes, they don't quantify the trade volumes and all, which would be very relevant, even not just to the trading community, to the common man. A very good example is the Trump era, which was coinciding with the COVID, etc. So uh, during the Trump presidency, he imposed the maximum number of trade barriers on China, be it in quantity, be it in tariff, etc. But the trade statistics show that the trade volume between the two countries increased, or rather, it's mostly China into the US, increased
Yes, correct.
exponentially, partly due to the lockdown in COVID, work from home, where people were importing all kinds of monitors and those self-elevating desks and chairs. So the the quantity of trade really zoomed during that period. So um, obviously,
And and the only thing that the Americans did was pay more money because of the tariffs, basically.
possibly, yes, 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 and of course and as well as the container shipping rates also shot up. So they got a double blow, double whammy on that. Yeah. So that's globally. So I think I even India and China, they are at loggerheads all the time, but the trade volumes are very impressive. At least with the India China, it's a bit more balanced. So that is there. Another example which you may have experienced probably in your cloudness days is this sudden Australian reaction, Chinese reaction to Australian imports of everything. Um, some of it seemed irrational. Bulk carriers with iron ore, coal came in and were waiting for 50, 60 days. I don't know whether they got paid the damages in the end or not. Yeah. So that was one.
I agree. I
Mm,
agree. Those are good examples,
yeah.
and obviously interesting to hear about current views that you have. Obviously, with your ships now, how do you incorporate geopolitics into decision making, Captain Dutt?
Okay. Again, yes, that is something we are facing firsthand on our ships now. We operate them in the pool. The pool, okay, they toe the line because of their sensitivity being Danish owned. Some of our ships are US financed by US funds, so that makes it more complicated. Now the pool may have a broader view of the sanctions, but because we are US funded, they say specifically that no, you can't even call Russia. We say, for example, edible oil. Edible oil is not a sanctioned commodity, but the US says no because of this. The freight would probably come in from a Russian linked company. So, depending at which point of the value chain one is in, one gets more affected. For the tanker owners specifically, they have had very many bad years until 21. So, for them not to have the opportunity to make not profit really, just to recover their losses of the past years is really very very depressing then, that if they can't make up for the losses they incurred.
Yeah, that is actually true, and obviously it is again a mix of economic, geopolitical, and even geo-economic factors that you come into it. What I would also like to understand, given your experience earlier with previous companies as well as the pool that you are having the ships in, is there a lot of technology today which is available, information? You mentioned social media, you mentioned a lot of other technological value chains which comes in. Does that help you manage these geopolitical risks, predicting where the potential challenges exist? How do you comply with these challenges? Is it easier today with technology to manage these geopolitical risks? Maybe some examples would help if possible.
Firstly, coming to technology, it is being used not just by us, but people who are trying to oversee the sanctions to some extent. Yeah, they are private entities, but they try and give you first-hand updated reports by pulling up data from all these AIS operators and then analyzing it and then giving much drilled down information about ships or companies which are probably evading sanctions. They are able to identify ship to ship operations which could be carried out by a suspected vessel. They've even gone to the extent of suspected cargoes, which really we are totally at a loss. There's no way you can determine that a cargo has a suspected origin. You could probably trace the ship. So it is to some extent, because not all the information is accurate, it works against the ship owner. So you need to again use the same technology to defend yourself what these service providers are doing. So I think that helps, because your basic information of your port clearance, your ship's actual track versus what they perceive the track to be. So we are using that, keep abreast of. You never know when a charge could be, particularly being in the tanker trade, operating in the Arabian Gulf. You could get sucked in inadvertently into any of these so-called mistaken identities. Yes, yes, and that is it. Yeah. So again, I may not be able to answer your question in totality, because we do a lot of edible oil trade, which is not the same as petroleum products.
Absolutely. No, I got that. And I thank you for your answer. I will now move on to one topic where both of us are closely involved, which is the Institute of Chartership Brokers and the SMU, where we are teaching. Um, this is a place, or this is an area where I'm very keen to kind of connect with the audience, especially the students. So especially when it comes to things like Institute of Chartership Brokers, that there is a constant need to update the syllabus with regard to SMU, because we have lectures. We obviously are able to add additional material based on the current updates as such. But obviously, with the books being outdated in some cases, we need to add in additional value. How do you see geopolitical developments and lessons from geopolitical aspects being incorporated into education, both in where you teach at the SMU and how you look at, for example, teaching at the ICS, where you are a tutor as well as me? How do we incorporate this more? How do we actually create more value and awareness of it? Any thoughts on this would be very interesting for us to maybe even act upon going forward, Captain Dutt.
Mm. Yeah, Punit, your point is very relevant, because it relates to what is happening present day. For students also, the textbook cannot keep abreast of everything, whereas what's happening present day, and it may not be in the syllabus, but it is so relevant. In SMU, it's the ITI, International Trading Institute, who are running our program. For them, it is even more relevant, because they would, after graduation, join the trading companies like Glencore or Trafigura or Koch, or So I think these examples which you have quoted in your some of your cases in Claveness, or even these thing about the containers moving between India and Pakistan, would be fascinating for them, that these things happen as a reaction to geopolitics. So and teaching by example is probably the best way, because it penetrates immediately. and it sort of etched into their memory. And yeah. So coming to the institute, yeah, they you just mentioned that in the SMU we have the flexibility and the freedom to keep updating the syllabus every term. Sometimes I have to do it, like I was telling them a very interesting example. This was just happened at the start of COVID. um, um, those huge container ships used to transit the Suez Canal. Each one cost something like $750,000 just to pay Suez Canal toll. So a few things happened about 2 months into COVID. Fuel prices collapsed because air travel was totally gone. China manufacturing stopped. So I can't remember which, it was a CMA or a ONE vessel coming down from Europe on its way back to Far East. It should have turned into Gibraltar and through the Mediterranean. The owner saw that, look, um, there's no cargo when the ship reaches back to China. Fuel prices are down. They took an instantaneous decision. No, forget it. Why pay $750,000? Let's go around the Cape. We'll consume the same value in bunkers because bunkers have become so cheap. So it shows how dynamic our industry is, in shipping.
Absolutely. And opportunities are immensely available across if people are actually aware of these changes that are happening around us. And I think you're very right. So basically, what you're saying is a $750,000 worth of bunkers were consumed, and you were no better off than what you were otherwise, basically.
Because you have to take these decisions very fast. So to be able to do that itself shows how dynamic our industry is. So your second part of the question was the Institute of Chartered Shipbrokers. Yes, we've been members so long, and we see that really something needs to be done for all the subjects, books. I keep saying, I mean, I've told the ETC and the head office earlier that the first reference or guide to change is the book should mirror the industry exactly. Then it becomes much easier to know what needs to be replaced, what needs to be put in. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you. And eventually, I think that the idea will have to create a digital book at the end of the day. I mean, you need to have a book which cannot be paper centric. It has to be, because the pace at which I've been teaching the geopolitics course now for a few years, and I need to sometimes change the material halfway through the course because because something goes on and happens, and obviously changes are all the time interesting. So it's very, very interesting. A final point now that we're basically coming now to the end of the podcast, but I wanted you to just share some views for the students, because I always end the podcast with a request for our guests to talk a little bit about what you feel the future really holds for the maritime industry, for the students and the young ones who are coming into the industry. What should be their focus? What could be some tips that they can actually take away from your experience, your knowledge, and something that you think they should focus on, which can help them prosper and do better in the industry? So just a few tips, maybe with regard to what to look out for or what to maybe avoid as well.
Okay. Without being too critical, I tell the students that, look, please look up from your mobile phone and see what's happening. Just listen to the news, whatever, BBC, and read the headlines of the newspapers every day. It'll take you about between 5 to 10 minutes, and then you'll have a better grasp what's happening outside. The Ukraine war, Russia war, how it is affecting stuff. You don't have to drill down too much, but it will give you a fair idea. US sanctions on Venezuela, they can't export their oil. And then once you read that, then you start thinking, especially if you're doing things like the ITI course, or if you are a student doing the ICS exams, because these relate to what you're doing. So yeah, simple. Spend about 10 minutes reading the newspaper or then listening to the news, and that's it.
Absolutely. And obviously the Seatrade Maritime Podcasts,
And
including
yes,
these ones. very interesting as well, because now the beauty is the ability to just listen on when you're in, when you're traveling, when you're moving. You don't really need to worry about getting access to the information at any point of time. You can get them even when you're flying. Now you can get your internet up and ready. You can actually listen to a lot of things. So I think that's very good advice, that news and geography are two things which I always believe have helped me in the maritime industry. So it's great to see a validation from your side. I would love to really, really thank you, Captain Dutt. It is always a pleasure talking to you. And thank you so much for gracing and coming as a guest on the podcast. Thank you so much, Captain Dutt.
Thank you, Punit. And again, yeah, I'm honored to be here, especially after Mr. Khalid. Yes, so I feel elevated.
Well, you're right there in the same category. Thank you so much, Captain Dutt. All the very best and lovely talking to you.
Thank you, Captain Dutt and Punit. That is all we have time for this week, and thank you for listening to the Seatrade Maritime Podcast.